Hello and welcome to Illustration Book Art and Artist Book. So today we're going to work on word-image relationships in books. But we will start a little bit by questioning matters of definitions because that's something that, as we can see, as we'll see, is not so straightforward. We'll then have a really short history of the book to start seeing how this relationship kind of gradually changes through history. And we will have a particular look at what happens around 1830, 1850s, because that's a moment that's crucial in the history of illustration. Once we've done that, we're going to look at the diverse word-image relationship, and we're going to look at a panorama of diverse word-image relationship, specifically in books, but that can be also applied to other contexts. So let's get started. So let's, one of the most fun games that I like to play with my students is to try and define illustration, artist book, and book art. So why do I like to do that? Well, because nobody agrees on the definition. And that's one of the very first problem one encounters when working on illustrated material. It's really one of definitions. The definition of illustration, for example, remains a topic of debate and reflection in artistic and academic circles alike. There are several aspects to this definition that actually create ambiguity. So the first problem that you encounter when you're talking about definition of illustration is the general use, because illustration can be associated with simply making something clear. And of course, this contradicts most of the practice of fine arts illustration that tends to complicate things rather than clarify. Another issue actually comes from the variety of the practice itself. It is not graphic design, and it is not painting, and it is not quite drawing either. And the various materialities of illustration create ambiguity, especially when it comes to new practices, such as digital illustration, 3D, or even animated illustration. So that kind of problem of definition is even made sharper by the problem of the materiality. But another thing that's often brought forward when we're talking about illustration is the problem of the autonomy of the artist. So many illustrators will claim that they're not artists, and unfortunately, many illustrators shy away from giving this status to their work. There are many good reasons for this, because they might think that it sounds arrogant or elitist, or because their teachers and publishers have told them so. But the limited choice of subject matter and the being a response to a text, to an idea, is nothing new when it comes to fine arts. And we cannot forget that artists such as Raphael or Michelangelo were commissioned artists and were working. Their work was often anchored in existing texts. So that's precisely where the art is, that capacity to go beyond the boundaries of the text and to set one's imagination free. So you can see that I'm partial. I do think that illustration is a fine art and a creative work. So this last two aspects, the variety of practice from individual prints, book illustration, posters, infographics, covers, 3D animation, scientific or technical illustration. So that variety of practice and this ambiguity around the status of the illustrator as artist have consequences. So illustration as a fine art practice has stayed relatively marginal in fine art schools until recently. It also has dear consequences when it comes to the history of writing the discipline. And remember that that's the first step. If the discipline is not written, there is, as is a history, there is no discipline. And what we have seen in most of the 20th century and earlier publications on illustration is a focus on anthologies. So instead of having history of illustration, we had a specific choice by that specific author of the illustrations they liked. And often that means a complete marginalization of certain types of illustrations, like poster, like technical or medical illustrations, etc. So so really the developments that we see now in illustration, in the illustration field, come from relatively recent scholarship that's been driven by a number of different disciplines like the fine arts, sociology, anthropology, artistry and cultural studies, of course, for example. So you have key surveys of illustration, but as I said, very much based in that tradition of the anthology from the earlier kind of publications. So books like Ruhmann from 1930, Simon in 1942, Melot in 1944, or Hillis Miller in 1992. And these volumes are really important to the development of the field because they kept a visual presence for the field. But it's really recent global historical surveys, such as what Joanna Drucker's book, The Century of Artist Books from 2004, or Patricia Minardi, Another World from 2017, or the very recent and very good history of illustration of Yalin Grove, Whitney Sherman, and Susan Doyle from 2018, that are really changing the game because they shift the way the field is being studied. So the field of illustration itself is moving from the survey book to more analytical and academic studies. And illustration is now broadly considered as an emerging academic field with special chairs and academic programs and practitioners. So that is developed from the practitioner's point of view, but also from the academic's point of view. So that didn't really help us define illustration, did it? And as I said, this is a game I often play, I always play with my students in my illustration course because I think it's important that we find a working definition for the semester when we have the class, so that we can agree on a definition. It's quite rare that we find a definition that the whole class agree on, but there's usually we try usually to find some common ground, some common points that we can agree on as a class, and that allows us to work for the semester. One of the things that we often agree on is that illustration has communication at its core. Some prominent scholars of illustration, such as Alan Mal or Yadin Grove, also agree that illustration is at the core of the illustrative practice. Alan Mal, in his book Illustration, A Theoretical and Contextual Perspective from 2007, says that this communication is the raison d'être, so the essence of the being of illustration, because it's a matter of intent of communication. And what we see is that Doyle, Grove, and Sherman, in their introduction, also put that element of communication as essential to illustration, to the essence of illustration. This is a quote from their work. Simply put, and I quote, "Simply put, illustration is visual communication through pictorial means." And for them, it doesn't matter how delightful or accomplished the art piece is. The matter of the intent of communication. And for them, that's the core of what illustration is. So whether it is independent or autonomous or not, what seems to be essential for them to the definition of illustration is this matter of communication, and the fact that images originate meaning. That's really an important element. So the main problem that we have when we define illustration as communication is the broadness of the definition, because if we define it as such, then indeed cave paintings and religious painting can be defined as illustration. It does not solve the matter of 2D, 3D, or animation. And it doesn't really clarify the relationship between text and image. So one can ask, is the illustrations process of meaning making independent from the text that it's often associated with? So you see that while this consensus of illustration as communication helps us understand better what illustration is, it's not sufficient for us to be able to define illustration. So it's a starting point, but it doesn't really help us. Very often when I want to define illustration, I try to put boundaries and try to define what it is not. And that's where we get into definitions of artist books and book art. Unfortunately, the matter of definition is not simplified when one tries to kind of establish boundaries with artist book, because artist books suffer from the same slippery definition as illustration does. And we'll have another session on the artist book where we will discuss those the definitions of artist book, because they don't really help us put them apart from what illustration is. So, how to tackle this? Well, let's start by trying to tackle it historically and trying to look at a very short history of images in books. And you can see that that's one way of simplifying the matter of the definition of illustration, is to say, well, illustrations are in book. But we know inherently that this is wrong, because we have poster illustration, we have separated prints, etc. So we know that it is illustrations in books are part of the definition of illustration, but are a too limited definition of illustration. But it's a way of grasping those relationships, of starting to kind of trying to define what that relationship look like. So I'm going to do now the shortest history of the books that you will ever hear, I think. The point of this is mostly to help you think about that relationship between word and image in books. And really to start thinking about how the techniques also shift, and also really to focus on what happens in the 1830s to the 1850s, because that's really the period where things start shifting for illustration and where it becomes a really interesting practice, I think. So if we look at the pre-printing press time, images were, for a very long period, the main conveyor of printed information. Think of almanacs, of stained windows, popular prints. Already in this pre-printing press period, you really have a landscape that has a lot of images in books. And that's something that we tend to forget. And already in that pre-printing press period, there are distinct types of illustration depending on the target public. And illustration can, on one hand, be the sign of luxury and exclusivity, or it can be seen as a means to pass on information to a public whose reading is assumed as deficient. So here, for example, on this image, we have two examples. We have one block book, which is the Biblia Pauperum, so the Pauper's Bible. And so the block books are called block books because they're carved on one block of, each page is carved on one block of wood and printed as such. And the principle of the Pauper's Bible is, so it's something that appears in the later Middle Ages. And the principle is that the picture are actually dominant in the text, because the public that is being addressed is assumed to be a public that cannot read. So the main mode of communication of the stories, of the narratives, is the image. So you can see also that the words that are spoken by the little figures are often kind of written in scrolls coming out of their mouths, and very often you see parallels between this and modern cartoon strip, for example. But it's, I mean, while those Bibles were not intended to be bought by the poor, but they were much cheaper, and they were affordable for priests to then be able to convert people, to discuss religion with people that were not able to read. So you see the image here is dominant because it addresses a public that cannot read. Whereas the other book that you see, the illuminated manuscript that you see here, is a luxury item. What you see here is the Belleville Book of Hours. It dates from the mid-15th century, and it belonged to the daughter of Charles VI of France. Marie de Belleville, and it's a really beautiful illuminated manuscript. And you can see here that the image has a different function. It's not a narrative function, it's an ornamental function. It makes the book precious. It doesn't convey the narrative, it enriches the narrative. And if you look at the balance of image, you can see the purpose of those images. And it kind of defines a relationship. So for example, in the Popper's Bible, what you see is the domination of the image on the picture space. And you see that the text is pushed to the margins because the center of the communication goes through the images. Whereas with the Book of Hours, you have something quite different, where the text is very dominant. It's very graphic, it's very beautiful and aesthetically refined, but the images are decorative. They are the ones on the edge of the page. So you see that from that very crude kind of first impression, we can see that already in the images that you have here, you can see that there is a specific relationship that for each of those books. Things change with Gutenberg and the printing press revolution because the image is then reassessed. So I've put here, so in 1440, Gutenberg discovers the movable type, and it shifts something in terms of the balance of the image in text. And it's partly due to the printing techniques. That's why I've put you here on a little, on the illustration, a printing press, so that you can see that the blocks of texts are kind of determined and put in the press. So the printing process is really a printing process of text. The illustrations or the decorations that come around the text here are purely decorative, and there's not much room for them left because the text takes most of the space. So while the printing press leads to kind of a tide of book and secular learning, what we see is a loss of power, if you want, from a purely visual or image-based books towards very much a word-anchored culture. And it will take a while for those images to shift back, to find back their place in the everyday life of people. And that's what happens. So I'm fast forwarding massively now in the beginning of the 19th century. So in 19th century Europe, illustrations start to proliferate. The term illustration itself, is, in French at least, is a neologism in 1830s. And it's only when the famous magazine L'Illustration comes out, is founded, that the expression becomes more familiar. And we're talking the 1840s. So a word that's for us very, represents something that's very anchored, is not so common until the 1840s. So what's interesting is that illustration gradually became, at the beginning of the 19th century, an obligation for any kind of literary launch. So why were illustrations so popular? Well, there's a significant increase in printed material, which is itself a consequence of technical improvement that are reducing production costs and a general increase in literacy. So the technical development, they had an influence on the production of paper, printing, binding machines, making the whole process of printing a book much more cost efficient. The number of readers in the 19th century, for example in France, soared because of educational development in the 1820s and 1830s. So that was linked to educational laws that reinforced the importance of schooling and this linguistic homogenization that was taking place in France at the time. So you have the Loi Guizot, for example, in 1833, Fallou in 1850, Ferry in 1882. So all those laws that are kind of anchoring schooling and education, and particularly literacy, as core to education. So there is the technical printing aspect of the book, there is the readership, And on top of that, you have the use of techniques that offer greater freedom for the artists. And that are also cutting down production costs. And for example, lithography became extremely popular under the Restoration, so in 1814, 1830. And you had a revival at the same time of established techniques like wood engraving and etching that were really popular amongst Romantic illustrators from the 1830s onwards. So this development also means that the images are cheaper to produce. And because they're cheaper to produce, and there's also a bigger demand for them. So at the time, the role of illustration can be manifold. They can be substitute for deficient reading, they could be educative, they could be support, they can be caricatures to expand the text, they can be all kinds of things. But they also can be just a commercial enhancement. But at least they are establishing themselves as adding a value to the publication. And another thing that happens in the 19th century is that gradually the images re-enter the texts. So what you see in the early 19th century is images that are vignettes, so that are relatively separate from the text. And what we see gradually happening because of technical improvement is the integration of those vignettes into the text. So here you have a nice example. It's Joanneau, who's quite a famous illustrator of the 19th century, who here modified the traditional setting of the page and integrated the image in the text of Charles Naudier's Histoire du roi de Bohême et ses 7 châteaux. And what's interesting here is that you have a description of a character that keeps being interrupted by the image, because every time you read through the line, you have to stop to look at the picture. So the image kind of fights for authority in terms of the description with the text. So that's I think that presence of the image also increases. So what we find, I think what I find really interesting is also that because they're there, because they're cheaper to produce, because people like them, what you see is that illustrations are gradually given a greater role in the daily life of people, and you find them a lot in newspapers and all kinds of things. So what actually one could probably argue that what William J.T. Mitchell called the pictorial turn actually doesn't start in the late 19th century, but in the early 19th century. So we really have here, I think, in that really short history of the book, I think you can see how from being used to pass on information to basically being marginalized in the book because of production reason, to being re-brought into the book as an added value, if you want, to the text. Illustration kind of tends to come and go. There's of course a lot of difference in terms of the luxury books, the printing capacity, the production, the readership, and the artist, in functions of the countries you're looking at, in functions of the geographical areas, but also the periods. All that doesn't happen at the same time everywhere, but at least it gives you an idea of the process. The process is the same, more or less everywhere. So what I hope this short history gave you is the sense of the dependence of illustration to its social context, its technological context, its aesthetic context, and those are things that we're going to carry on exploring. So let's move on now to look at the relationship between word and image, because I think we've already seen that in our examples here through the history of that relationship, of that placement, if you want, of the images in the book. we can see that the relationship between word and image can be quite different. So, for example, you can have a very literal image because you're doing an advertisement for a specific narrative, for example. It can be complementary, where it comes and adds something that's actually not in the text. It can be critical, it can compete, it can be a lot of different things. And I think it's important to think carefully about that relationship, because the relationship between word and image in such books is very much dependent on the intention of the illustrator. So I have a couple of examples here just to give you a little bit of panorama, and also to help you think through those relationships. And again, it's not something that's solved. It's something that is very much a matter of discussion and very much changing depending on the context that you're looking at. Klimovsky has, to define these relationships, established three categories. So he thinks that the image can be reflective, so help people think further than the text, provocative, so challenging the text, or decorative, really just as an ornament. I really like this triad, but every time we discuss it with students when we start looking at images, the problem we have is that they're rarely just one of these. It's quite rare that you have an illustration that's reflective but not decorative at all, or that's provocative and not reflective. So the categories, while really tempting in terms of that action of the image on the text, or that dynamic between the text and the image, does not encompass really completely those relationships. So we usually also like to look at Alan Mal, who's really one of the leading scholars on illustration, but who comes to it from more a practitioner's position. This is how he splits those relationships. So the first one that he sees is documentation, reference, and instruction. And of course, here he's referring to natural science, medical illustration, technical subjects, etc. Those kinds of illustration, which is already something very rare in the field. Very often in the field, we don't look at those scientific illustration, unfortunately. So I think it's really good that that's acknowledged. Also, because if you think about illustrations of even adventure books, for example, I'm thinking about Jules Verne's illustration, you will have that idea of instruction, reference, and documentation coming through in some of the illustrations. We'll come back to it when we talk about children's book later on. So that's the first kind of relationship that he identifies. The second one is one of commentary. And when he's developing this, he's really talking about politics, current affairs, etc. So something that has more to do with engaging with political life and current life. Then the third relationship that he identifies is one of storytelling, where the image, and I think he's mostly thinking about early readers here and picture books, where the images are here to affirm the fiction or anchor the narration. So they're here to help the text do the storytelling. And you have some very funny examples of that, where you have a storytelling that's actually also playing with that, where the stories, where the images actually tell completely different story from the text. And that's also something that's quite interesting, I think, for us in terms of thinking about those relationships. So documentation, commentary, storytelling, persuasion. And when he talks about persuasion, what he's thinking mostly about is advertising, promotion. So he's thinking about posters, he's thinking about advertisement, he's thinking about, again, another type of illustration. And finally, he identifies a relationship of identity, so corporate branding, books, music, design. And I think what I really like about what Alan Mal does here is that he actually considers illustration in its diversity, which often is not the case when people think about this relationship word and image. And what's also interesting is that, again, just like for Klimovsky, it's quite rare that an image is doing persuasion without doing identity, or is doing storytelling without doing commentary. So again, those different categories are fluid categories. But I think it's important to start by identifying the intent of the illustrator, so that you can really build your analysis, and that you can think about of the illustration not as a passive next to the text and submissive to the text kind of element, but rather as an active element in the meaning-making process for the readers. And I think once you're shifting your position of thinking from this passive to the active, I think that makes illustration scholarship a lot more interesting. So that's all I wanted to talk to you about right now. And I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you for your attention.